Chapter 6. The convent stood on a rising ground near the fjord, so that, with most winds, the roll of the surf on the beach drowned the sighing of the pine woods that covered the great part of the ridge's slopes, north and west, and hid the sea from sight. Kristin had seen the church tower above the trees when she sailed by with Erland, but the pilgrimage out to the nunnery that his forefather had founded, which Erland had sometimes said they must make, had never come about. She had never landed at Rhine Cloister before she came to make it her abiding place. She had thought that the life here would be like that she knew at the nunneries in Oslo or at Bach. But here much was otherwise than there, and it was far more quiet. Here the sisters were truly dead to the world. Lady Runhild, the abbess, made it her boast that it was 5 years since she had been into the market town, and as long since some of the nuns had set foot outside the bounds of the cloister. There were no children here to be nurtured, and at the time Kristin came to Rhine there were no novices either. So long was it since any young maid had sought to be taken into the sisterhood, that it was 6 winters already since the last, Sister Bjorkhild Marcelina, had taken the veil. Youngest in age was Sister Turid, but she had been sent hither in her 7th year by her father's father, who was priest of Clement's church, an exceeding strict and earnest man, and the child had had a shrivelled hand from birth, and was besides something of a cripple, so she had donned the habit as soon as she reached the age for it. Now she was 30 years old, and sadly frail, but she had a lovesome face, and from the first day she came to the cloister, Kristin took great joy in serving her, for she thought that Sister Turid reminded her of her own little sister Ulfhild, who died so young. Sira Eilif said that low birth should assuredly not stand in the way of any maids who were minded to come hither to serve God. Nevertheless, so it had been that, ever since the convent had been set up, few but the daughters or widows of mighty and high-born men of the Trondheim country entered there. But during the evil and restless days that had been in the realm since King Hakon Harleg of blessed memory died, piety seemed to have fallen away greatly amongst the great nobles. Now it was the daughters of townsmen and well-to-do farmers, for the most part, who turned their thoughts to a convent life. And they rather went to Bach, where many of them had been nurtured in godliness and womanly handicrafts, and where the sisters for the most part were come of homely people. There too the rule was not so strict, and the cloister did not lie so far from the highway. Howbeit it was not often that Kristin had the chance to speak with Sira Eilif, and she soon saw that the priest's duties and his footing in the cloister were both toilsome and ticklish. Though Rhine was a rich cloister, and the sisterhood scarce numbered half as many nuns as the foundation might have fed, yet its money affairs were in great disorder, and it was hard put to meet its outgoings. The last 3 abbesses had been more pious than worldly wise. None the less they and their convent had fought, with tooth and claw, to make good their freedom from the archbishop's obedience. So far did they go in this, that they would not even take counsel proffered in fatherly goodwill, and the brethren of their order from Tautra and Munkebo, chosen to be priests of the convent church, had always been old men, so that no colour might be given to evil speaking, and their guidance of the cloister's worldly wheel had been none too skilful. When King Skule built the fair stone church, and gave his Udal manor to the cloister, the houses were first built of wood, and they had burnt down 30 winters before. Lady Oldhild, who was abbess then, began the building of them up again in stone. Much was done in her time for the betterment of the church, and the goodly convent hall was built. She had journeyed also to the general chapter at the mother house of the order, Tart, in Burgundy, and from that journey she had brought back the noble ivory tower that stood at the choir near the high altar, a fitting tabernacle for God's body, the church's greatest adornment, and the nuns' pride and darling treasure. Lady Audhild left behind her the fairest renown for piety and worth. But her unskilful conduct of the building works, and her unwise dealings with the convent lands, had wrought mischief to the cloister's welfare, and the later abbesses had not had the skill to repair the wrong that had been done. How it had come about that Sira Eilif was sent thither as a priest and counsellor, Kristin never learned, but so much she understood, that from the first the abbess and the sisters had met him as a secular with misliking and mistrust. And so it was Sira Eilif's task at Rhine to be the nun's priest and spiritual guide, to set the husbandry of the estates on its feet again, and bring order into the convent's money affairs, while deferring to the abbess's overheadship the sisters' right of self-governance and the right of the abbot of Tautra to oversee all, and keeping friends with the other priest at the church, a monk from Tautra. His age and his name for unstained purity of walk and conversation, humble fear of God, and skill both of the canon law and of the law of the land, stood him in good stead. But he had to walk most warily in all his goings. Together with the other priest and the church servants, he dwelt in a little house lying northeast from the cloister. It was there, too, that the monks lodged who came out from Tautra on many occasions. Kristin knew that, if she lived so long, some time when Nicolaus had come to be ordained priest, she should hear her eldest son say Mass in the convent church. Kristin Lavransdatter had been received at first as a commoner, but after she had taken a vow of chastity and obedience to the abbess and the sisterhood, before Lady Runhild and the sisters, in presence of Sira Eilif and 2 monks from Tautra, and in token that she forewent all rights over worldly goods, had put her seal into Sira Eilif's hands to be broken in pieces, she was given leave to wear a garb like the sisters, but without the scapula, a grey-white woolen robe, white head linen, and black veil. The intent was that, after some time had gone by, she should seek to be received into the sisterhood as a professed nun. But it was still a hard matter for her not to think overmuch on what had been. To read aloud during meal times in the refectory, Sira Eilif had written out in the Norse tongue a book of the life of Christ, made by the general of the Minorites, the most learned and godly Doctor Bonaventura. And while Kristin listened to it, and her eyes filled with tears as she thought how blessed they must be who love Christ and his mother, pains and afflictions, poverty and humility, in such a way as was there written, yet all the time she could not but remember the day at Huseby, when Gunnulf and Sira Eilif had shown her the Latin book from which this was taken. It was a thick little book, written upon parchment, so thin and shining white, that she had never believed calfskin could be wrought so fine. And there were the fairest pictures and capital letters in it, the colours glowing like jewels against the gold. And while she looked, Gunnulf spoke laughingly, and Sira Eilif gave assent with his quiet smile, of how the buying of this book left them so penniless they had had to sell their clothes and get meat along with the almsfolk in the cloister till they came to know that some Norse churchmen were come to Paris and made shift to raise a loan from them. When, after matins, the sisters went back to the dormitory, Kristin would tarry behind in the church. On summer mornings it was sweet and delightsome to her there, but in winter it was bitterly cold, and she was fearful in the dark among all the tombstones, even though she kept her eyes bent fixedly on the little lamp that burned always before the ivory tower with the host in it. But winter or summer, while she tarried in her corner of the nuns' choir, she thought of how Nakvi and Björgulf were now watching and praying for their father's soul, and that it was Nikolaus who had begged her to join with them in these prayers and penitential psalms each morning after matins. Always, always, she saw before her those two. As she had seen them that grey day of rain, she went out to the monk's cloister. When Nikolaus stood before her in the parlour of a sudden, marvellous tall and strange in the grey-white monk's habit, with his hands thrust under the scapula, her son, and yet so changed. Most of all, it was his likeness to his father that moved her so deeply. It was as though she saw Erland in monk's garb. While they sat talking together, and he asked her to tell him of all that had happened at the manor since he took his way from home, she was waiting. At length she asked fearfully if Björgulf would not come soon. "I don't know, mother," answered her son. A little after he said, "For Björgulf it has been a hard struggle to bow beneath his cross and serve God. And he took fright when he heard that you were here, lest too many thoughts should be called up again." Thereafter she sat on, deathly sad, gazing at Nikolaus while he talked. He was much sunburned in the face, and his hands were worn with toil. He said with a little smile, now he had to learn after all how to guide a plough and work with scythe and sickle. In the hostel that night she could not sleep, and she hastened to the church when the bell rang to matins. But the monks stood in such a way that there were but few faces she could see, and her sons were not amongst these. But next day she walked in the garden with a lay brother who worked there, and he showed her the many rare plants and trees it was renowned for. While they walked, the clouds broke, the sun came forth, and with it the scent of celery and onion and thyme, and the clumps of yellow lilies and blue columbines that decked the corners of the beds glittered with great raindrops. And then came her sons. They came forth, both of them, from the little arched door of the stone house, and Kristin thought that she had a foretaste of the joy of paradise when she saw the two tall brothers in light-hued raiment come down towards her on the path beneath the apple trees. Yet they did not speak much together. Björgulf was silent nearly all the time. He had become a giant in frame, now he was full grown, and it seemed as though in the long time they had been sundered, her sight had grown keener. Now, for the first time, she understood to the full what the battle was that this son of hers had fought, that doubtless he was still fighting, while he grew so great and strong of limb, while his inward sight waxed keen, and he felt his eyesight grow dim. Once he asked after his foster-mother, Sigrid Undset. Kristin told him that she was wed. "God bless her," said the monk. "She was a good woman. To me she was a good and faithful foster-mother." "Ah, yes. I think, almost, she was more a mother to you than I was," said Kristin sadly. "Little must you have seen of the mother's heart in me when you were tried so sorely in your youth." Björgulf answered low, "I thank God, none the less, that the enemy was never suffered to bow me to such unmanliness as to try your mother's heart, though I felt it. But I saw that you bore too heavy a burden already, and after God it was Nikolaus here who saved me, those times when I was like to fall into the tempter's power." No more was said of this, nor of whether they were happy in the cloister, nor of how it was said they had done amiss and brought disgrace upon themselves. But it seemed to give them great joy when they heard it was their mother's purpose to take the veil in Rhine convent. When, after this hour of prayer, Kristin went back through the dormitory and saw the sisters sleeping two and two on sacks of straw in the bed, clad in the habits which they never put off, she thought how much unlike she must be to these women, who, from their youth up, had done nothing but serve their Maker. The world was a master whom it was not easy to fly, when once one had yielded to its dominion. And, in sooth, she had not fled the world. She had been cast out, as a hard master drives a worn-out servant from his door. And now she had been taken in here, as a merciful Lord takes in an old serving-maid, and of his mercy gives her a little work, while he shelters and feeds the worn-out, friendless old creature. From the nuns' sleeping-house a covered way led to the weaving-house. There Kristin now sat alone and spun. The nuns of Rhine were famed for their linen, and those days in summer and autumn, when all the sisters and lay sisters went to work in the flax fields, were like feast days in the cloister, but most of all the day the plants were pulled. The nuns were busied in most of their working hours with making ready the flax, spinning the thread, weaving the linen, and making vestments from it. There was no one here who copied or adorned books, as the sisters in Oslo under Lady Groa Undset had done with such great skill, nor did they practise much the craft of broidering with silk and gold thread. In a while she would hear with joy the sounds of the wakening farmyard. The lay sisters went to the kitchen house to make ready the food for the serving folk. The nuns didn't touch meat or drink till after the Mass of the day, except when they were sick. When the bell rang for primes, Kristin went to the sick ward, if any lay there, to take the place of Sister Agatha, or of whichever other nun was there. Sister Turid, poor soul, lay there often. Soon now she might begin to look forward to the morning meal which followed after the third hour of prayer, and the Mass for the cloistered serving folk. Each day alike Kristin took joy in this comely and solemn repast. The refectory was timber-built, but a fair hall notwithstanding, and there all the women in the cloister ate together. The nuns at the upper board, where the abbess sat in the high seat, and where the three old dames, who were commoners like herself, also had seats, and the lay sisters further down. When the prayer was ended, the meat and drink borne in, and all sat eating and drinking in silence, with still seemly behaviour, while often one of the sisters read aloud from a book, Kristin would think that, could folk in the world outside but take their meals in such a goodly way, they might well come to see more clearly that food and drink are gifts from God, and they would begrudge them less to their fellow Christians, and think less on scraping together for their own and their children's behalf. But she herself had felt quite otherwise when she spread her board for a flock of wildest riotous men amid laughter and uproar, while the dogs snuffled about beneath the board, or thrust up their noses and got a meat bone or a whack, as the mood of the boys might chance to be. Travellers seldom came hither. At times a vessel with folk from the noble seats around would put in when sailing up or down the fjord, and men and their wives with children and young folk would go up to Rhine to greet a kinswoman among the sisters. Then there were the bailiffs from the cloister's farms and fisheries, and a messenger from Tautra now and then. At the feast tides that were kept with great estate, Mary Virgin's Mass days, Corpus Christi, and the day of St. Andrew the Apostle, folk sought the nuns' church from the parishes on both sides of the fjord, but otherwise it was but those of the cloister's tenants and workfolk who dwelt nearest that came thither to the masses. They took up but little room in the great church. Then there were the poor, the almsfolk who had their doles of ale and meat at fixed times under rich folks' testaments, in requital of yearly masses for the donors' souls, and who, besides, drifted up to Rhine well-nigh daily, sat by the kitchen-house wall and ate, and when the nuns came out into the courtyard, made up to them to talk of their sorrows and troubles. Sick folks, cripples, and lepers wandered out and in. There were many here who suffered from leprosy, but it was ever so in the sea parishes, said Lady Runhild. Tenants came to crave abatements in their rents, or grace time for their payments, and these had always much to tell of hardships and adversity. The more wretched and hapless these folk were, the more open and unashamed they were in telling the sisters of their condition, though most often they blamed others for their ill fortune, and had pious words always on their lips. It was not strange that the nuns' talk at recreation and in the weaving house ran much on these folks' lives. Nay, Sister Turid avowed to Kristin that when the nuns met in convent to take counsel together concerning bargains and the like, the talk would often wander and turn to gossip about the folk who were mixed in the matters in hand. Kristin saw by what the sisters said that they knew little of what they talked about, except what they had heard from the folks themselves, or from the lay servants who had been out into the parish. They were passing easy of belief, whether their underlings praised themselves or spoke ill of their neighbours. And she thought with anger of all the times she had heard godless lay folk, aye, even a beggar monk like Brother Arngrim, cry down the nunneries for dens of scandal, and tax the sisters with greedy swallowing of waif rumours and immodest gossip. The very folk who came hither and dinned Lady Runhild's ears, or any of the sisters they could get speech of, full of idle talk, would be the first to blame the nuns for talking among themselves of the tidings that reached them from the world they had renounced. It seemed to Kristin it was the same with the talk of the convent ladies' luxurious living. It came from folks' mouths who had many a time had both morning bite and breakfast at the sisters' hands, while these servants of God watched, prayed, and laboured fasting before they all met for their first solemn meal in the refectory. So Kristin served the nuns with loving reverence in the time that must go by before she might make profession. A good nun she could never be, she thought. She had scattered abroad all too much what gift she might have had for meditation and piety, but she would be as meek and as steadfast as God would give her grace to be. It was now well on in the summer of the year 1349. She had dwelt in the Rhine convent 2 years, and before Yuletide came, she was to take the veil. And the glad tidings came to her that, for her dedication, both her sons would come out thither in Abbot Johannes' train. Brother Bjorgulf had said, when he heard of his mother's purpose, "Now is my dream going to come true. I have dreamed twice this year that before Yule we should both see her. Though wholly it appeared in my dream, it cannot be, for in my dream I saw her." Brother Nicolaus, too, had been overjoyed. But at the same time she heard other tidings of him that were not so good. He had sorely mishandled certain farmers up the fjord near Steinke. They were at odds with the cloister over some fishing rights, and when the monks came upon them one night while they were busy breaking up the cloister's salmon weir, Brother Nicolaus had hurt one man grievously, and flung another into the river, and therewithal had sinned heinously in the matter of cursing and swearing.